The Handkerchief, written by GR8T78. Harry Potter and the Wizarding World is the sole masterpiece of J.K. Rowling. Chapter 23, Behind Caldwell the Cantankerous. This is a new low, even for you, Draco Malfoy. Hermione hissed the words at him, arms crossed in fury. It had been an eventful Quidditch Saturday, which had been preceded by an eventful couple of weeks. Umbridge had continued making her case for worst teacher in the history of Hogwarts by issuing a decree banning all clubs and gatherings. The school chorus has nearly had a meltdown, and the Gardening Society was planning mutiny in Greenhouse 5. After all, the Quidditch teams had been disbanded and only the Slytherin team had been reformed. The other teams struggled to get their teams approved by the so-called High Inquisitor. Which was a laughable joke really. If Slytherin had no one to play, what was the point of even offering Quidditch to them? Thankfully, the other teams were eventually all approved. As the two rivals were set to play soon, the members of Gryffindor and Slytherin houses began using small, then ever-intensifying hexes against each other in the halls and during meals. Katie Bell's hair was turned temporarily white for the duration of History of Magic. Vince was chased down the hall by an enchanted clarinet that made farting noises. Then, Alicia Spinnet was attacked by pixies in the library, and Warrington was found tied and gagged on the fake forest floor of Firen's classroom. It was common knowledge that the Weasel was a horrible keeper, and Draco took the piss out on him regularly in the halls, pretending to drop things and generally fumbling as though his hands were covered in butter. It angered and upset the Weasel, which as far as Draco was concerned, was a win-win situation. Oh, the Quidditch match had not gone well for the Slytherin team. The Weasel had fallen apart, of course, that was to be expected, but the rest of the Gryffindor team had done enough to eke out the win. Draco felt responsible for the loss. He had done all he could, but it had not been enough. But apparently his poem about Weasley, which Millicent Bulstrode had been nice enough to create a melody to fit, while hilarious, had appeared to incense Hermione to the point where her eyes looked almost like two small orbs of fire when they met late that evening. "Is this about the song?" he asked. "No, it bloody well isn't about the damn song, Malfoy. That wasn't good. They were back to surnames." "Oh, then it's about Potter and the Weasley twins." Her eyes flashed at him angrily. Harry, George, and Fred had all been ousted from the Gryffindor Quidditch team. That had been an unexpected, yet welcome result of the game. For once, Draco appreciated something that Umbridge had done. All it had cost him was a black eye, a few bruises, and his tentative progress with Hermione this year. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. It was the world's worst waltz, and he wasn't currently enjoying the dance. Her fury had started with the fistfight that Draco had provoked, though to be honest, it had been mostly one-sided. This information did not seem to affect the amount of rage radiating off of Hermione as she paced behind the Caldwell the Cantankerous statue. The topic of his song was next. Hermione found it to be repugnant, but actually forgivable. She said the ridiculous song was only words after all. Mean-spirited, but nothing more than one might hear at any sporting event. The jab about Mrs. Weasley had been uncalled for, even Draco admitted. Even as he called her fat and ugly, the image of her kneeling with Mr. and Mrs. Diggory on the ground by their son came into his mind without warning. He pushed it away and persisted roughly, needling Weasley about his father next. How was he to know Potter would be the one to jump in? In retrospect, of course, it made perfect sense. Potter liked to stick his nose into things that was clearly none with this business. And Potter likely saw Mrs. Weasley as a mother figure. Draco got the sense from Hermione that Potter did not get along with his Muggle family well. "I didn't know Potter would get involved." How could he not, Draco? If your best friend was being attacked, wouldn't you do something? The question brought him up short, even as Hermione's diatribe continued. It was not something that had ever crossed his mind, to be honest. If asked who his best friend was, could he even say? Surely not Vince or Greg. They could be nice on occasion, helpful quite often, but his best friends? No, just casual ones. Not Pansy, Flint, Bletchley, Montague, or Warrington. He was close with Theo and Blaze, but the two of them were closer to each other. Having endured the trials and tribulations of step-familyhood simultaneously these past years, Tiberius Knott had cycled through a variety of witches in the years since his first wife's death. Some treated the young master not as invisible, superfluous. Others were downright evil. Draco knew what a complete bastard Tiberius Knott could be, and he had no doubt that Blaze's stepfather Selwyn wasn't any different. Truthfully, the only person's face that flashed before his mind was Hermione's, and the thought left him breathless for a moment. Because what was a best friend, after all? Someone that you shared your innermost feelings and fears with. Someone that you admired, who helped you when they could and whom you helped in return. How in the name of Merlin had he ended up with a Gryffindor as a best friend? And would she even say the same in return? An image of Potter, Weasley, and her laughing at the Gryffindor table in the Great Hall crept into his mind. A kind of golden trio, the three of them together. But has she ever told them about us? Draco wondered. And it gave Draco a measure of satisfaction knowing that at least, there was this. She did not tell them everything. Because if she had, he knew Potter and Weasley would have come after him by now. It was clear that the Weasel at least thought of her as his girl, his witch. But he didn't know everything. He reached out a hand tentatively as she passed, catching her by the elbow. Hermione, I truly didn't mean for Potter to catch the brunt of it. And the same for the two Weasleys. I don't care much for the youngest kid, but the two of them seem all right. I'm fairly certain that Umbridge removed the three of them and not Ron because she knew they were the best members of the team. Because let's be honest, Ron folded like a house of cards out there today. He smiled wickedly as a small smile crept across her face, hidden under her hand. It was first-time jitters. I seem to recall your first game not going that well either. How the hell was I supposed to compete with a bloke that was willing to catch the damn snitch while his other arm was broken? You know my teammates still bring that up occasionally. It had been a sore point for Draco. Hermione let out a small laugh at this. He was determined, I will give you that. Besides, he had to suffer plenty for that win. That night in the hospital wing with the Skelligrew wasn't pleasant. Well, for that, he can blame Lockhart. Hermione's eyes flashed in mild indignation. You should not speak ill, Professor Lockhart. Oh, I forgot you had a thing for that tosser, he teased, taking her now in his arms. I did not. She exclaimed hotly, even as her flush denied her words. Admit it, you've always had a thing for poncy blonde tossers. She smiled slowly and met his silver eyes with merriment. Perhaps I have. He lowered his head slowly and captured her lips in a kiss, tilting his head to slot his mouth over hers. She sighed, opening her mouth to allow his tongue to find hers. Draco breathed deeply, taking in her floral scent. It felt so familiar, like the gardenias in the solarium at home. He relished the feel of her in his arms. She was so soft, so yielding to him, it took all of his strength not to pick her up and press her against the wall behind them. To his surprise, it was she who grabbed him by the shoulders and spun him, pushing back until he was against the wall. She ran her hands down his biceps, and he could not help the small moan that escaped him as her hands found his waist. He ran his hands down her back, thumbs encircling her waist for just a moment. As her own hands ran across his chest, his traveled up her sides, feeling the swell of her breasts beneath the fabric. She moaned a bit, but after another moment of hungry kisses she pulled away reluctantly. I have to go. Please don't regret it, he nearly whimpered. Don't regret us. I don't. Her eyes shined up at him. But I need to go. Ron didn't come back to the common room after the match, but he should be back soon. Draco left all the taunting about Weasley's playing unsaid. When can I see you again? I'll still be here, there's still classes going on. As far as I know, Umbridge hasn't cancelled those as well, she smiled coyly. You know what I mean, he smirked knowingly at her. I'm not sure. We've started a kind of club. She seemed hesitant to finish the sentence, and Draco recalled the decree that had disbanded clubs and gatherings. Is this something to do with Umbridge? He asked, hoping she trusted him enough to speak freely. It wasn't his business, but Merlin, he wanted her to trust him. Yes. Good, take her down. Draco responded simply. Hermione smiled and drew him down for a parting kiss. Good night, Hermione. Good night, Draco. Chapter 24. Seeing the Strells? Sunday night, he waited for her in the library, but she never appeared. Neville Longbottom showed up looking agitated and frantic, sitting at the table that Draco thought of as Hermione's. Neville was a bit of a mystery to Draco. He had been raised in their pureblood society by a grandmother known for her brashness. This circumstances was rather unusual for a pureblood wizard, but because the Malfoys and Longbottoms moved in barely overlapping social circles, it had never occurred to Draco to ask anyone why. He studied Neville. The wizard looked tired, but then most fifth years did. They were in the thick of their studies this term, and the sheer volume was overwhelming to many. But this fatigue almost seemed deeper. He thought back to a few days past, when Neville tried to attack him without any clear provocation before class. That had been very weird. Draco looked around. No Slytherins were here. Seeing as it was Sunday, most were likely holding off until the last possible minutes of Thursday night to start their weekly assignments. He stood and approached Neville, dragging his feet slightly so as not to seem like he was sneaking up on the boy. Neville barely looked up, then went back to studying his essay for mistakes, evidently determined to ignore Draco. Draco cleared his throat. Neville, he said by way of greeting. Neville frowned down at his work. What do you need, Malfoy? There was a hard edge to Neville's voice. Draco suddenly realized that he had merely intended to talk with the wizard, forgetting for a moment that they weren't actually friends. He coughed. Sorry. Just wanted to ask if you had the charms assignment from last week written down. I forgot to write the page numbers Flitwick told us to look over. Neville flipped through numerous texts on his table, finding a homework journal and opening it. 120 to 126. Thanks. Draco turned as though to go. Whatever you're playing at with Hermione, it needs to stop. The hard edge was even harder in Neville's voice. Draco stopped and turned, his mind blank and his panic level at high alert. What did Neville know? What had he seen? I'm not sure what you mean, he said slowly. I saw you. Last night. You were with her behind that statue near Gryffindor Tower, the one of the angry-looking wizard. You kissed her. When she showed back up in the common room 15 minutes later, she looked upset. Upset how? Draco racked his brain to recall anything he'd said at their goodbyes that would have upset her. She was just red in the face is all. Neville seemed red in the face himself now. Her hair was kind of everywhere and she looked flustered. Well, Nev, a good snog does that to a woman, Draco smirked with a false bravado. Neville scoffed. Whatever, Malfoy. If you're pranking her or trying to get information for your ministry hag, you can sod right off. The other wizard's eyes blazed angrily. My ministry? You mean Umbridge? She's not my ministry hag. She's an old lady with a way of inserting herself into situations that don't involve her. Are you sure she's not friends with your grandmother? Draco tried a small grin. This made Neville stop short to think. Maybe. The idea and admission made them both chuckle unexpectedly. I'm not pranking Hermione, They were what, kind of friendly? That's what the kids are calling it these days. Neville shot back wryly, making Draco laugh again. I just mean, we're not enemies. Not really. My name is Malfoy, but that doesn't mean I agree with everything my father believes. What do you believe? Neville countered. I'm not sure. I know what I've been told my whole life, but I also know what I've seen. You know what I'm talking about. Every pure-blood family has those members that think that way, about Muggleborns. Granger is Muggleborn, But she's the smartest witch I've ever known, and she's only known she's a witch for about 5 years. Neville sighed. Yeah, I guess I do know what you mean. Most of my family thought I was a squib until about 2 years before I came to Hogwarts. Never any accidental or wandless magic. I know my gran still loved me, but my uncle and his wife always kind of treated me like dirt. Joking that I'd have to go be a chimney sweep or a milkman for the muggles, like that was the worst fate in the world. Neville scratched the nape of his neck thoughtfully. But what about you-know-who? What about him? Draco asked warily. Do you think he's back? Draco paused. It was one thing entirely to deny the superiority of pure blood over Muggle-borns. It was another to go against the Ministry, Voldemort's supporters. Essentially every person he had grown up knowing by revealing what he suspected to be the truth. I don't know. He paused, then said a bit quieter, I hope not. Well, that's something, I suppose. Neville tiredly rolled up his scroll and reached for a different book. He rubbed at his eyes and sighed. I guess. Draco dropped his eyes. He could tell there was more on the other wizard's mind. So if you're willing to admit that about Muggle-borns, why do you still act like a first-class wanker in class? Draco exhaled slowly. There are expectations. From other Slytherins. From my father. And word gets around. If you're not speaking out against certain things, you're automatically suspect in some people's eyes. You shouldn't say things like you said the other day. Neville looked down at his hands angrily. What? About the addled people in St. Mungo's. It's not their fault that they're there. They don't deserve to be made fun of. Here Neville's voice was choked, and Draco realized with shock that there were tears in the corners of Neville's eyes. He swiped at them blindly. Some of them were heroes, Aurors who fought you-know-who. With a dawning of horrific realization, Draco suddenly understood several things at once. Why Neville wasn't brought up by his mother and father. Why he'd been so willing to scuffle with Draco in first year. Why he nearly punched Draco that day before class when Draco had joked about the addle-brained St. Mungo's. That, based on Neville's age, whatever had happened to them happened at least 15 years before in the throes of the First Wizarding War. Neville, he tried tentatively. I didn't know. How could you not? The other wizard spat out. Surely you talked about it at Christmas dinner in Azkaban with your dear old aunt. Draco was completely out of his depth now. The only aunt he'd ever known anything of was the mysterious aunt from the Muggle books in his closet. He didn't know who that was, but he was certain that she had nothing to do with whatever this was. Longbottom, I apologize, but I haven't a clue what you're on about. I don't know any aunts of mine. Who are you talking about? You're saying you don't know who Bellatrix Lestrange is? Neville huffed angrily. Bellatrix. He repeated blankly. That name did sound familiar. He'd caught it in his parents' whispers occasionally, heard it uttered by Lucius's friends before they'd realized they could be overheard. He'd read it in old articles that he'd dug up about the First War. He couldn't quite place it. But the feeling he got from the name was the feeling one got when hearing a sound unexpectedly in the dark. A sudden unease, a general sense of foreboding. This aunt was not the same as the one who had given him a book called Alice in Wonderland. I really don't know. I'm sorry. I'm not sure what she did to you or your family. She tortured them. She drove them to insanity and then didn't even have the mercy to end it, to spare them and everyone around them from the pain. You think it's a joke to see your mother with a mind like a 2-year-old child. Hell, Neville, mate, I'm sorry I didn't know. The idea of it horrified Draco. For all of his mother's failures to protect Draco from his father, he knew it was only because she needed protecting from him herself. Draco could not imagine the pain of seeing her and yet knowing she was not really herself on the inside. Neville was quiet except for a few sniffles. Draco looked away to give him some privacy, then after a few moments spoke again. No matter what, Longbottom, I need you to know that my intentions with Hermione are good. I'm not just playing a trick or trying to shag her and leave her. She's too good for that. And I really didn't mean to imply that your parents were what I said that day in class. I'm sorry to hear about what Bellatrix did to your parents. She sounds awful. I'm glad I don't know her. So long as she stays the hell in Azkaban, that's the most important thing. Neville's hardened tone was back. He began gathering his books, scrolls, and quill. But he met Draco's eyes and gave a firm nod as though they'd reached an understanding of sorts. Strangely to Draco, it almost felt like friendship. Oh. The following Tuesday was Care of Magical Creatures, and word had gotten around that Hagrid had returned sometime the previous weekend. He was at dinner Monday night. Thankfully, Umbridge wasn't in the Great Hall while he was there. If Draco were being honest, he looked like death. The giants hadn't killed him, but it looked like they'd tried. As Draco and his group of Slytherins made their way down the hill towards Hagrid's cabin, Draco was excited. Despite the other Slytherins' jeers and slurs towards the teacher, he distinctly heard Pansy make a joke about Hagrid looking like a giant shaggy dog. And Draco thought privately that perhaps she ought to choose a different species of animal, considering her close resemblance to a certain canine breed herself. He was chuckling inwardly at this when they reached the hut and Hagrid began to direct the group towards the forest. Draco had not had the best experiences in the Forbidden Forest, and he wasn't eager for a repeat. But he figured there was safety in numbers and in daylight, at least. That did not stop Potter from laughing a bit at Draco's clear discomfort. Draco sneered back at the wizard angrily. They reached a clearing, where Hagrid dropped the bloody carcass he was carrying and began an odd, haunting call. A few people tittered uncomfortably. They waited, everyone staring around in curiosity. Then a dark creature emerged from the trees just next to them, white eyes shining brightly in the dim forest clearing. Draco inhaled sharply. They were studying the Strauss today. Many magical folk considered them bad luck, death omens. But Draco had seen them since his first day at Hogwarts, and based on the discussion around him, he was one of the few. Oh, and here comes another one. Now put up your hands, who can see him? A handful of people raised their hands, but from his viewpoint, Draco saw Professor Umbridge moving down the path towards the clearing. He was not going to allow her access to any more information about him than she already had. He kept his hand down. Hagrid continued on, yeah. Yeah, I knew you'd be able to, Harry. And you too, Neville. And Draco met Hagrid's eyes and shook his head slightly. He knew that Hagrid could tell then both he and Theo had seen the Distrowls, but he didn't want to speak about it, and neither did Theo, he was sure. The Distrowls made him uncomfortable, both for their strange appearance and for their association with death. He knew from his reading that the Distrowls could not be seen by witches and wizards who had not witnessed and processed death. Indeed, they could not even be touched or felt unless the magical person had been told of their presence. Draco had not known all of this in his second year, arriving at the platform in Hogsmeade and stepping off. This time not to the boats that crossed the Black Lake but to the carriages. He had shared a carriage with Tracy, Warrington, and a quiet fifth-year named Violetta. They all thought he was taking the mickey out on them, talking about the creatures in front of the clearly horseless carriages. Knowing that this was a different sort of magic, he'd waited until a flew call home to ask his mother, who had explained about the Distrowls. How Hagrid and the previous gamekeeper Og had raised them, and how seeing them only meant that he knew more about death than his classmates. The death he had seen was an experience that he'd much preferred to have forgotten, to be sure. Draco had been 6 and in the room when Abraxas Malfoy had finally succumbed to dragonpox. It had been ugly towards the end, the open sores oozing a green-tinged fluid, drool mixed with bile pooling on the pillow. His skin shriveling and scaling slightly. Draco had tried to look mostly at the ceiling, but Lucius had insisted that he look upon his grandfather's visage to say his goodbyes. Abraxas had not been a kindly or loving grandfather. Had barely spoken to Draco more than 10 times despite the generations living under the same roof. Narcissa had objected to Draco's exposure to Abraxas' final moments, but Lucius had insisted. Draco watched in quiet horror as the Distrowls made a meal of the cow carcass. He looked over at Theo, who looked to be turning a delicate green shade. Theo certainly had seen death. When he was 3, his mother had died giving birth to his younger sister. He'd not been in the room when she passed, but had felt the death intensely. As he was now left alone with a father who felt burdened by his children. The baby girl lived, but remained sickly with a blood disorder. At the age of 6, Tavinia had been bitten by a nest of doxies in the Knott Manor gardens and quickly developed doxy influenza. An antidote had been given almost immediately by the governess, but had little effect because of Tavinia's blood disorder. Tiberius Knott was traveling, unreachable by owl or flu. And so it was Theo and the governess and a small group of house elves who had sat with Tavia. She sweat, then shivered, then sweat again. Theo told Draco months later that he knew she had passed when she stopped screaming. He'd said it harshly, as though to push through the emotion he clearly felt as a young 9-year-old. Tiberius had finally returned 2 weeks after the funeral. He had been told that she was dying well before Tavinia's passing, of course, but claimed that because she was so far gone with the influenza, he was of no use to anyone in the manor, so he would finish his work travels. 2 days after Tiberius' return, Theo had told him all traces of Tavi were gone. Her room was converted to a regular guest room. Her pink bed with its gauzy drapes had been vanished. Her toys and books were boxed up and sent to an orphanage recommended by the governess. The young and sweet-tempered governess herself has been dismissed, supposedly for Tavi's neglect. Replaced by a curmudgeonly matron with a limp and a penchant for listening to the wireless all day while a house elf rubbed her feet. So yes, Draco surmised, Theo knew death quite well. By this time, Umbridge had toddled up importantly, clipboard in hand, presumably in her role as the High Inquisitor. She immediately began treating Hagrid with the utmost contempt, as though he were incapable of comprehension, hearing and speech. Several of the Slytherins giggled silently. Hagrid pushed on through the lesson, imparting details that Draco had read before in the text but also information that could only be gotten from spending time with the fearsome, unusual creatures. Umbridge was now pantomiming walking as though no one knew what walking was. Pansy dissolved into a fit of giggles and Draco have a hard smile along with her. This woman really was daft. She asked Pansy, "You found that you were able to understand Professor Hagrid when he talks?" "No. It sounds like grunting a lot of the time," Pansy answered, ever the suck-up to the most powerful person in the room. God, he kind of hated her sometimes. Draco rolled his eyes, then caught Hagrid's good eye, the one that wasn't swollen shut with bruises, and gave him a small smile of encouragement. Yeah. Good stuff about the Strels. Once they're tamed, like this lot, you'll never be lost again. Amazing sense o' direction, just tell em where you want to go." Hagrid trailed off as Umbridge wrote more on her clipboard, turning it so that Pansy and Millie could read it. Both girls laughed raucously as though it was incredibly clever. "Assuming they can understand you, of course," Draco said loudly to redirect Hagrid's attention, offering another smile. Hagrid looked at him and smiled slightly, seeming to relax a bit as he remembered their exchange about Starklaw and Buckbeak years before, in which Draco was the misunderstood one. He quickly glanced at the discomfiting creatures in front of him, then remembered he supposedly couldn't see them and looked away. "You can see the Strels, Longbottom, can you?" Umbridge broke away from her Slytherin fan club to look back at the rest of the group. Neville nodded slowly. "Who did you see die?" My granddad," Neville replied, put on the spot by Umbridge's terse and flippant attitude towards his grandfather's death. Umbridge's curiosity satisfied, she moved on to a new topic and Draco met Neville's gaze with a small nod of solidarity. Umbridge was now harassing Hagrid again, and Draco's annoyance was renewed at this. It was one thing to mess with Sybil Trelawney and her quackery. It was entirely another to come after Hagrid. Draco's attention was drawn to Hermione, who stewed angrily at the treatment of Hagrid by Professor Umbridge. Furious tears shone in her eyes, and he watched as she removed a familiar swatch of fabric from her sleeve and dabbed at them. He locked eyes with her, trying to offer solace with his eyes. He knew there was nothing he could offer at the moment, though. Umbridge was on a war path, and nothing was stopping her. Oh. The class finally ended, and the students left in groups of 2 and 3. Draco saw Theo move towards Blaise, and the two quickly moved up to the castle. He sighed. Stuck with Vince and Greg again, he'd have liked to talk a bit about the whole experience of his grandfather's passing and his own presence. But the two boys he was now with seldom generated much thoughtful discussion. Ahead, The weasel was saying to Potter, "I'm surprised so many people could see them, free in a class." Hermione looked saddened by something, whether it was Umbridge's treatment of Hagrid or the morbidity of the lesson he wasn't sure. He popped off with the first quip that came to mind to distract her. "Yeah, Weasley, we were just wondering, do you reckon if you saw someone snuff it, you'd be able to see the quaffle better?" Vince and Greg immediately started singing "Weasley is our king" over and over again, as it was likely the only words they remembered from the whole song. It was unnecessarily rude, and he would need to apologize to Hermione later. But she'd given him the smallest of smiles along with a roll of her eyes as the three boys departed. His interruption had served its purpose. She no longer looked so sad, and Draco was no longer in a funk about the class either. Abraxas' death was a memory, a bad one, but one that didn't need to be revisited and ruminated upon. And Hagrid, even with his quirks, was a good teacher. Despite the macabre subject matter, it had been an interesting and useful lesson, and Umbridge shouldn't be able to find much fault in it. Oh. Chapter 25. Draco's Army. Draco holed away in his room that night to write to Hermione. Quite the creature's lesson today. Hope Hagrid wasn't too upset, the old oaf. Can't believe he actually had the bollocks to trot out a herd of Vistrals. By the way, his injuries still looked fresh, wonder why. Please don't call him an oaf. And the Vistrals were highly interesting. I wish that evil cow would mind her own. As for his injuries, I have wondered the same. Perhaps they're magical ones spelled not to heal. Giants don't usually possess magic, so unless one got hold of a wand, I doubt it. Maybe he just keeps walking into trees. It was several minutes before she replied. "How did you know about the giants?" Draco paused. He'd heard from his father, of course, who had heard from other Death Eaters. But confirming for Hermione that his father was one was a big step. He sighed. He was in too deeply to turn back now. "My father mentioned it. His side thought Hagrid was killed by them." She answered. It does seem like they made an effort. A moment passed, then more of her thoughts appeared. "Draco, please. I told you we were forming a club. If your father asks if anyone is planning anything against Umbridge or Voldemort, please don't tell your father. Or anyone associated with him." He responded immediately. "I wouldn't betray you. Or anyone else doing whatever it is you're doing." He paused, then wrote more. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Her reply came quickly. "I don't think so right now, other than keeping our secret." "Of course I will." And he would do everything in his power to do just that. Oh. Next morning, he emerged from his dormitory, trudging down the steps to the common room. It was surprisingly empty. But then again, the weather was supposed to be sunny today, which meant it was one of the last nice fall days before the tedium of a Scottish winter. He idly wondered if he could convince Hermione to meet him at the far side of the lake for a picnic. Classes had been called off for St. Andrew's Day. Apparently Umbridge was good for one thing, making sure that Hogwarts observed all the ministry days off. Just the man I was hoping to see. Theo was pulling off rubber boots and a jacket. As an early riser, he'd probably watched the sun rise after a 5-mile jog. Draco yawned tiredly. "What's up?" he asked. "You remember, of course, the topic of conversation from the other night." Draco stopped short. "You mean your idea about learning defensive magic?" "Yeah. I've had a few ideas. I want to run them past you. First, I was thinking we need a meeting place. Somewhere, and it wouldn't be unusual for us to be together, but a place where we can keep people out that we don't want." Right. Vince and Greg always wanted to hang around the other three boys, and at times it was hard to shake them off. Then there were a handful of third, fourth, and even a few sixth years who had taken to trying to join their group at mealtimes or in the common room. So, the immediate problem is what to do with bacon and eggs. I was thinking, maybe we should say that we're forming a diet and exercise group. They will run faster than a kappa from sesame oil. Do kappas not like? Do try and keep up, Drake. So anyway, I'm thinking we use classroom 4 down the corridor. There is an office in back, we can have workout equipment and also work on defensive spells in there. The classroom itself is rather damp and musty, so no one will be tempted to go in. Yeah. That should work. Who all are we talking about here? Well, so far it's you and me and Blaze. I think Violetta could be persuaded to join us, but she's afraid. Best leave her off then, let's keep it to just us. You're probably right. If she joins us and ends up lusting after me, it'll make things pretty awkward. Theo leered knowingly. Quit being an absolute skis, Theo. I haven't even eaten yet today. Perfect, then your diet has already started. Get Thorn and send a post to quality, Quidditch supplies. We need a weight set, a punching dummy, some mats, an exercise bike, and a massage table. Theo pulled an apple from his pocket and bit into it. Chip chip, the delivery has all got to get cleared by Filch, and I want to get started tomorrow night. What the hell are you going to do with a massage table? Draco asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Was I not clear that Violetta might join? Quit perving, you sick tosser. Draco summoned the apple from Theo's hand, then threw it back, aiming for body mass. Fine, maybe a house elf is looking for extra work. Theo cried to his retreating back as he left the common room for breakfast. I'm not listening. Draco called over his shoulder without turning. Oh. Supplies ordered after breakfast, Draco walked down to the Quidditch pitch to see what was what. Several members of the Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff teams were conducting an informal scrimmage. Some students were doing yoga along the banks of the Black Lake, led by Luna Lovegood. Blaze was reclining nearby, pretending to read a book as he watched the witch over the tops of the pages. Potter was taking advantage of the day off to use the weasel's inferior broom. This meant that Hermione might be free to meet. He removed his handkerchief from his pocket and pretended to wipe his brow. Vinca Major. Can you meet for a picnic in a couple of hours? I can get Dobby to make us something. You know he isn't your servant anymore, right? Sorry. I can ask Dobby to make us something. Where do you want to meet? He looked at the Black Lake again, teeming with students. The chances that they'd both be able to sneak away without being waylaid was minimal. 12:30 at the Astronomy Tower. I'll be there. Oh. Dobby was a good friend, and happily packed cold roast chicken sandwiches and cherry tarts along with elderberry juice in a basket, which he promised to deliver to the tower at 12:25 exactly. Draco finished his jog and hurried to the prefect bath to clean himself up, pointedly ignoring the salacious looks from the mermaid painting over the tub. He arrived just as Dobby was settling the basket on a striped blanket spread out on the stone floor that had been warmed by the sun for the last few hours. He called his thanks just before the small elf popped away and just as Hermione rounded the corner of the stairs. Your picnic, madam, he said, bowing and gesturing broadly. She narrowed her copper eyes even as she smiled. These sandwiches look professionally made, good sir. Did you make them? Services provided by a good friend, he said, settling down on the blanket and pulling her down to sit in his lap. It's good to have friends in high places, she murmured as she nibbled his ear softly. Yes, my girlfriend lives in the highest tower in this place, you know. He stroked his fingers up and down her back, enjoying how she writhed under his touch. Do I know her? She asked innocently. You know everything, Swat. Don't pretend you don't, he teased as he licked a spot just under her ear. She squirmed a bit in delight. You're right. I also know that I still have an arithmancy essay to write and a potions project to work on still today, so let's eat. With that, she moved to sit on the blanket and began unmapping sandwiches and tearing open packets of crisps. Draco poured the elderflower juice, which she pronounced perfect, and they discussed their classes, Umbridge, and what they knew or suspected about Hagrid's travels. Neither could figure out where the fresh injuries were coming from. Both were impressed by the Vistral's lesson. Draco told her the cleaned-up version of seeing Abraxas die, and she talked a bit about her own grandfather Louis, who had died while she was at Hogwarts when she was 13. He asked how the new club was going, and if she had ideas for him, as he and Blaze and Theo would be starting their own version of it soon. Oh, Draco thought so. That's a good idea. I would suggest that you join ours, but yes, I think that would go over about as well as the blast-ended scroots. You're right. Well, we started with the disarming charm, then shield charms. Stunning spells, of course. Harry has taught us several impediment jinxes and the like. I think his plan is to cover bombardments, reducting curses, and the like. And at some point, he wants to teach us how to cast a Patronus. Draco was secretly impressed. He wasn't sure that he would be able to do half of those things, and told her so. I can maybe help, she asked tentatively. What do you mean? Well, you've said that Blaze and Theo already know about us. Maybe I can come and teach you three a bit, just the things we've covered so far. He kissed her hard, then that this brilliant witch would be willing to show him and his friends these things, it made his stomach flip. She kissed him back eagerly, threading her fingers into his hair and tugging gently. He smiled down at her and she shivered. Warming charm? He asked, and she smiled against him, patting the blanket beside them for her wand and casting it with a whisper. He was snogging her again when an odd flutter sounded nearby, followed by a pecking noise. They broke apart to find Marmalade, Theo's russet-colored owl, peering at them from around a note in her beak. And who are you, lovely? Hermione asked. Marmalade preened, dropped the note, stole half a chicken sandwich, and flew away. That's Marmalade, Theo's owl. What a clever name. I suppose, Draco said, unfolding the note and reminding himself to ask Theo what his fascination with breakfast foods was about. The note read, "Stuff is here, they delivered it to the common room. Come help me move it and arrange it all before everyone else is back." He sighed. Plan scuppered by one of his best mates. Hermione smiled. I need to go anyway. The essay, you know. It's only supposed to be 18 inches, mine is 23. But I still need to finish my last body paragraph and write the conclusion. She reached once more for her wand, but when she picked it up, they were both surprised to find in her hand Draco's hawthorn one she had left her own across the room in her bag. You cast with my wand? He asked in wonder. Well, I guess I did. I didn't think about it. I used Harry's years ago to open a locked door once, and I used Lavender's one time to curl her hair for Yule Ball. Hers resisted me so much, though I figured Harry's wand answering to me was a fluke. No one has ever used mine, he said, kissing her neck again. He didn't say it, but in addition to all of the investment and handshake and fire whiskey advice that Lucius had imparted over the years, he has been very careful to emphasize that no one should ever touch, have access to, or use his wand. That she was able to pick it up and effectively cast a spell was mystifying. He kissed her once more, cupping her head to his, then lay back looking up at her as the sun shone through her curls, catching the bits of gold and red that threaded through the brown. He was reminded of that day long ago, the day he pretended to be a Dementor and she'd appeared above him on the Quidditch pitch, the sun lighting her from behind like a halo. He'd told her then that he shouldn't even cross her mind. She was too good for him. Thank goodness she didn't listen to him. Oh. A pile of boxes were blocking the entrance to the common room when he got there. Each box, emblazoned with cuckoo S, for your every Quidditch need, looked like it weighed a ton. He'd hate to consider moving these without magic. Isn't this great? Theo bounded into the corridor, grin plastered upon his face. It would have been even better if you'd waited about 20 more minutes, Draco grumbled. The featherlight charms were put into place and they carried the boxes down the corridor and into the classroom floor. The boxes were unpacked into the office and back, and they spent a couple of hours assembling and arranging the items. By the time they were done, they had what could have passed for a Quidditch training room gym, complete with a massage table that Draco swore he would never touch with a 10-foot pole. Oh. That night after dinner, the three wizards assembled in the office, having told Vince, Greg, and the other boys that they were going to work out and talk about dieting. It worked like a charm. All of the boys stay behind in the common room to play Exploding Smap and sip mulled wine. At 8 exactly, the door creaked open and a mane of bushy brown curls came through. Well, shall we get started? She asked with a twinkle in her copper eyes. Chapter 26, Runaway Train. The Christmas break was a welcome reprieve for everybody. Getting away from Dolores Umbridge for nearly 3 weeks sounded like paradise. Draco was pleased to ride back to London with Blaze and Theo alone. They were able to discuss defense tactics and whatever else they liked without prying eyes or spying ears. As they rode in companionable silence, Draco read Hogwarts, a history. Hermione claimed it was her favorite book, and Draco had to admit it was fascinating. Drake, your girl has passed by 3 times. I think she's wanting to talk to you, Blaise drawled, not even looking up from a copy of the Quibbler. Draco stood so quickly he nearly fell as the train pitched slightly. He looked back at Blaise, who jerked his head left slightly with an amused smirk. Draco set off to the left down the corridor, peering into compartments languidly as he went. He tried not to make much eye contact with the Pansy, Vince, Greg, and Montague compartment. A group of first and second-year Hufflepuffs blushed and giggled as he nodded a hello and kept going. A compartment full of sixth-year Ravenclaws who appeared to be hotly debating something to do with arithmancy or dogs, he wasn't sure, ignored him. Finally, he came upon a compartment with Hermione, Neville, Dean Thomas Seamus Finnegan, and one of the Paddle twins, the Gryffindor one. They were a somber bunch and looked like they'd just been discussing something serious. "Sod off, Malfoy," Finnegan immediately called. "Merry Christmas to you as well, Finnegan," Draco tipped an imaginary cap at him. Thomas rolled his eyes and laughed. Draco grinned back to the group. "No Potter or Weasleys to entertain your lot with tales of poor, indigent children, and scary ghosts teaching people the true meaning of Christmas. You quoting Charles Dickens, mate? Didn't know you had it in you," laughed Thomas. Draco smirked and polished his fingernails on his jumper. "I like to consider myself well-read," he scoffed. In truth, A Christmas Carol was another of the books in the trunk in his room, the one from Aunt A. He turned to Hermione. "Granger, I believe we're assigned to patrol the train together for perfect duty." In truth, they had not been. A Ravenclaw 6th year and a Hufflepuff 7th year were on duty, but he knew the Ravenclaw was embroiled in that arithmancy dog debate. And based on the unusual smell and music emanating from the compartment into which he'd seen most of the 7th year Hufflepuffs disappear, Cambria Lawrence was going to be too busy staring at her hands and devouring whatever the trolley witch brought to do rounds. "You're right, I forgot, Malfoy." Hermione stood and smoothed her jeans over her bum self-consciously, drawing appreciative stares from Thomas and Finnegan. Draco gave them both go-to-hell looks that were missed entirely by the people for whom they were intended. Neville and the Petal Girl, however, caught the whole exchange and locked eyes, laughing silently. Draco wondered if the girl knew anything, or was just laughing at the 2 drooling idiots. "Be safe, Hermione," Neville called as she walked towards Draco. "I'll have her back in one piece if you're lucky, Longbottom. Can't have the class SWAT in danger, who would make us all look bad if something happened to her. Besides, if we get hexed, I'm certain Granger's hair will be an excellent shield." "Oh." They stepped into the corridor and he closed the door behind them. "Shall we start this way?" Draco asked, gesturing left. He did not want to pass back by the other Slytherins with Hermione, or the giggling firsties when it came down to it. "Sure." They passed the trolley witch, a handful of loudly caroling 3rd years that he told to sod off back to their compartment. And Hannah Abbott on her way back from the loo. Hannah gave him and Hermione an appraising look and Draco drew away slightly from Hermione. He hadn't realized until that moment that they'd been walking so close that their shoulders brushed and they were nearly leaning into each other. Hannah gave Hermione a questioning look and Hermione smiled and looked down. Draco groaned inwardly. Apparently every random witch could feel something was going on between them today. After Hannah passed, Draco muttered quietly, "You wanted to see me?" "Yes," she paused as 4 second-year Slytherins stepped into the corridor, spotted the prefects, and promptly turned around to their compartment to avoid getting caught doing whatever misdeeds they'd planned. Draco gave them his best hard stare as they passed the door. She continued. "Harry and the Weasleys left suddenly in the middle of the night. I only found out about it this morning. I wanted to message to ask you about it, but I knew with packing for Christmas and getting everyone to the train, it might look odd for you to stare at a handkerchief periodically." Draco narrowed his eyes. "What happened?" They stopped outside the restroom and Draco opened the door to confirm that it was empty while Hermione checked the trolley witch's alcove. Once they were satisfied that they were alone, they ducked into the alcove. Hermione cast a Muffliato and Draco cast a Repelling Charm and a Notice Me Not. Then he leaned against the wall, parting his feet and pulling her by the waist closer to him. He looked into her copper eyes in the filtered light from the small window and waited for her to begin. I don't have all the details yet. I was going to go to my parents for the holiday. We were set to go skiing in France, but I think I need to be with the Weasleys after what happened. Draco schooled his features to hide his annoyance at this. He knew that Hermione considered Ron and Ginny close friends. While he had nothing against the little Weaslette, his feelings about Ron were well known to everyone. So, what happened? Mr. Weasley was attacked. It was in the Ministry of Magic. It's not clear exactly how it happened, but apparently he was bitten by a snake. They allow snakes to roam the offices freely there. Draco was confused. He had only been to a handful of offices within the MoM over the years, but they seemed like ordinary enough places. Not places where a snake might hide. He remembered the various snake-related events of second year and shuddered slightly, drawing her closer. She smiled as though knowing what he was thinking about and rested her head gently on his chest. He was near the Department of Mysteries. Apparently the Order is patrolling there. Professor Dumbledore would not tell me much more. Order, he murmured softly, not wanting to disturb her as she rested against him. He felt his chest rumble as he spoke and she gave a small shudder of her own. He smiled above her head, resting his chin lightly on her crown and tightening his hold on her. The Order of the Phoenix. It's what we call our side. They have been patrolling the corridors outside the Department of Mysteries for several months now. They seem to think that you know who is searching for something there. Puzzle pieces slowly began to slide into place in Draco's mind. And you want me to try and find out what that is for Potter? If you can. We were nearly told about it this summer, but Mrs. Weasley thought we weren't ready to learn about it. But Mr. Weasley almost died. He still might. And Sturgis Podmore was sent to Azkaban for supposedly trying to break in months ago. We think he was Imperiosed. We think the other side is trying to get into the department and find something for him. He thought for a moment. It might be possible to lead Lucius into a discussion about it under the right circumstances. For her, he would try. I'll tell you what I find out. Thank you. She raised her head, and for a moment Draco worried that she was about to leave, but she moved her arms up his back instead, running her fingernails through the hair at the nape of his neck. It felt amazing, and Draco closed his eyes and leaned forward to give her better access. Her lips touched his tentatively. She tasted of chocolate frogs and cherries. Hermione was amazing. So responsive to his touch, so soft. He wanted to both devour her and also have her like this all the time. His brain caught that thought like a snag on a knitted jumper before tucking it away deeper in his mind. He pulled back to look at her. Her cheeks were pink, her curls floating wildly around her shoulders and arms. He drank in the sight of his witch, her magic sparking in the air around her. He surged forward to kiss her fiercely, wanting to stay there in that moment with her forever. He held her close, knowing that soon they'd be spending weeks apart, and not knowing how he would stand it. Oh. 10 minutes later, Hermione stepped first into the train corridor to check that the coast was clear, and Draco followed. They stepped quickly up the walkway, eyes averted from each other in bashfulness now that they were back in the bright light of the public eye. They arrived back at the door of the Gryffindor compartment just as the train began to slow as it entered King's Cross Station. He opened the door for her to enter. Here you go, lions. Not a hair out of place, see, Draco said, then turned to Hermione. Now that he looked at her more carefully, however, he realized just how out of place and wild her hair actually looked. Between that and the sparkle of her eyes, the misbuttoned cardigan and the flush of her cheeks, she looked breathtakingly beautiful. It took everything he had not to smile sappily at her. I don't know, Hermione, it looks a little out of place, smirked the paddle twin as she took it all in from where she was curled up with a copy of Witch Weekly. Luckily, Longbottom and the other boys were engrossed in a game of exploding snap and didn't notice the exchange or Hermione's even deeper blush. Happy Christmas, lions. Draco backed out of the compartment quickly. Happy Christmas, Snake, Parvati Padma trilled, her eyes still glued to Hermione, a wicked smile on her face as she looked at the incorrectly buttoned cardigan. Draco had a feeling that the giggly girl was not one to let this go, so he hurried away, heading to his compartment to gather his things. Quite a happy Christmas indeed. Oh. Chapter 27. Caged Birds. Draco's first morning back home had been relaxing. He'd been allowed to lie in, a rare luxury, in a dormitory with 4 other boys. Even on the weekends, Vince's snores grew louder as the sun filtered through the water of the lake outside. Or Theo, a perennial morning person, would be up exclaiming loudly about the previous week's professional Quidditch recaps. He laid back in his bed, one arm behind his head, languidly reliving the stolen kisses he'd shared with Hermione in the Hogwarts Express alcove. He lost himself in the memory a bit. There was a pop next to the bed, and Pym announced, "Mistress Malfoy wishes to see you in the solarium." She said it was urgent. "Thank you," Draco said swiftly, torn from his reverie. Pym popped away. Draco hurriedly dressed in his everyday robes and raced down the stairs. It was mid-morning, and his father was likely out of the house. If his mother wished to see him urgently, it might be something she didn't want Lucius to overhear. "Oh, Mother, you wished to see me?" he asked as he crossed the threshold of the French doors into the solarium. He approached the circle of curved pink sofas settled in the center of the wide, airy space filled with flowers and plants of every type imaginable. As he neared, his attention was caught by the sight of a small elf facing away from him. The elf was unfamiliar and clearly elderly, based on the wrinkles and large quantity of ear hair. The elf faced Narcissa and did not turn at the sound of his voice. "Draco," his mother effused. "I'm glad you were able to come. I'd like you to meet Creature again. Creature, perhaps you remember my son, Draco." Creature turned now and bowed deeply, bleary eyes damp as he took in Draco. For his part, Draco was uncertain when he had seen an older and sadder-looking house elf. The young scion of the ancient and most noble House of Black carries himself with a royal comportment befitting a young master, his nobility and regal graces. "Yes, Creature, Draco is a brilliant boy. Please tell me more about your time spent at Black House." Black House. Decade-old images filtered through his mind of dusty, cobwebbed furniture and menacing-looking grandfather clocks and umbrella stands. A row of dead elf heads like coat hooks lining a wall. A grasping, drooling woman with yellowed teeth and rheumy eyes. It had been all too disturbing for a young child that was easily frightened. Creature hesitated, clearly magically bound against revealing too many details. Draco held his tongue, confused about what this all meant. "Oh, my mistress would be so ashamed if she were to see the filth that Master Black allows into her house. Mudbloods, traitors, half-breeds, werewolves." Who was this Master Black? A few years ago, his mother had told him that when he was 17, he would become Master Black, as the oldest free male member of the Black family. Yet now apparently this wasn't right. Surely it wasn't Sirius Black. Draco assumed he was on the run, not holed up in the ancestral home. The last time Draco read an article mentioning him, they thought he was in South America. "You mentioned a few guests in particular. Can you tell me who they are again?" Narcissa inquired kindly. "Master has let in Harry Potter and his mudblood friend, Hermione Granger." Draco spoke her name quickly. "She's in the Black House. Is she safe?" Draco knew she was meeting up with her order, but had no idea the meeting was in the old Black family manor. Creature nodded, but appeared unable to say much more than he had already said. "Harry Potter cares for my master very much, and my master cares for him above all others. But the girl, Hermione, you have seen her there too." "Yes, the mudblood scum tries to be Creature's friend, but Creature wishes the mudblood filth would be gone." "Creature." Draco's voice was harsh, angry, authoritative. It honestly almost surprised even himself, as both Creature and Narcissa both startled slightly. "I order you not to call Hermione filth or scum or mudblood or any other derogatory term. She is to be treated with the respect befitting a witch." Draco had no idea if he could order this elf to do anything, but he was not going to stand by when Hermione was being treated so foully. "Draco." This time it was his mother who spoke. "If he begins calling her by her name, or even by the term Muggleborn, someone will notice and ask him who told him to say those things. I'm sure that others in the house have told him this before, but clearly he is still doing it. If he suddenly follows orders, that may appear strange, and he has to go back there without it seeming suspicious that he was gone. Fine. But you will not call her scum or filth, do you understand me? Why is he here anyway? Draco asked. Elf, who sent you here? My master told me to get out, and so Creature did as he was told. Creature came to see the only mistress of the ancient and most noble house of Black, of whom Creature knew the whereabouts. Mistress Narcissa's name is still on the family tapestry. Mistress Andromeda is banished, and Mistress Bellatrix is missing. Mistress Andromeda. This has to be the aunt of Draco's storybooks. And Bellatrix, the one Neville hated and feared. Bellatrix is stuck in Azkaban, think Merlin, Draco muttered, and Narcissa turned sharply to him. The elf likewise turned, bowing deeply to Draco once again. Creature thanks young master for his most valuable assistance. And with a pop, Creature had disappeared. Hold on, what assistance? Draco looked at his mother, confused panic on his face as he stared at a mirror image of the same emotions on his mother's. You know who Bellatrix is? She asked in shock. And you told him where she, oh, God. Draco, I think he's going there. Who is going where? Draco asked, panic rising in his chest. Creature. He said Bella was missing, so he couldn't go to her, but now? Draco sat heavily on a pink sofa, head spinning. Mother, I need you to explain several things to me right now. And with a look of dread and foreboding on her countenance, Narcissa began to speak. Oh. One of their own elves brought brunch to the solarium. Draco may have picked at a few things at his mother's insistence. But he was too worried to eat much as he listened to his mother's explanations. This whole situation was messed up. And it sounded as though Draco had made it infinitely worse by mentioning Bellatrix's location to the half-mad elf who had shown up unexpectedly. But the Dementors are in charge of Azkaban. No one can get out, he pleaded with his mother. Sirius got out. I knew Sirius as a child. He was boisterous, a lot of fun, good-hearted. I don't know what happened to him to change him, or even if he was guilty of all those murders, but he managed to escape. Bellatrix is, to be frank, insane. If she can find a way, she will do the same. She was boisterous as well, but never in a fun, loving way. I remember my poor bird, Seraphine. I was only 6 and I got Seraphine for my birthday that year. Andry was about to turn 8. Mother and father were going to get her a bird like Seraphine as well, so that they could keep each other company in the cage. Seraphine was lonely and would sometimes cry, it almost seemed. The sound of a pining bird can be so haunting, you know. But a week before Andry's birthday, Bella, she put on father's dragonhide boots so that her feet would be larger and stronger, and she held the bird down, and Here, his mother began to cry and heave so hard that she could not finish the story, much to Draco's gratitude. He had heard enough and did not want her to finish. His mother sobered enough to speak. After that, there was no way that mother and father could get another bird for Andry, or another one for me. They were afraid that she would do it again. She was only 10. By the time she was 12, after her first year at Hogwarts, she had moved on to stray cats and rabbits. But she wasn't so kind as to do it quickly. Sometimes at night, she would brag about keeping them for days caged out in the stables, torturing them. After that, Draco could not eat, and his mother did not force him to. His dreams that night were filled with crying birds and rattling cage doors. Oh, Hermione had written that the Weasley father would recover. Draco was glad to hear it. He didn't much care for the weasel, but had little problem with any of the others. And truthfully, the idea of getting attacked by a snake made Draco's stomach knot. So anyone who kept calm and carried on through that couldn't be all that bad. He was uncertain what to write to Hermione about the encounter with Creature. On the one hand, Creature had told them nothing about the Order other than to confirm that Sirius was working with them, a fact they had already deduced from other incidents, and that the Black House was being used to house Order members. While this was interesting information, it was of no use to them. Because the house was unplottable and now apparently sealed by a Fidelius charm, no one would be able to remember or locate the address, even if they'd visited dozens of times, as Narcissa had. But if there was a chance that Bellatrix could escape, they should be warned. In the end, Draco decided to wait and see what other information he could glean before writing. Surely Bellatrix would not break out of prison in the next couple of days. Creature was old. He barely looked capable of standing for more than a few minutes at a time. Maybe he was senile and would forget what he'd learned. Draco decided to use his time to find out what the Death Eaters were trying to find for Voldemort. The upcoming Christmas celebrations would hopefully offer ample opportunities. Christmas Day was ordinarily a festive affair at Malfoy Manor, with guests calling all afternoon. Champagne and gluing flowing freely. Tarts flambies baking in the kitchen. His mother made an effort to appear happy and joyful as a handful of well-wishers stopped by, but Draco could tell she was strained and tired. Towards 4 o'clock, when the champagne began making way for fire whiskey, Draco brought Theo and Blaise, who had come with their parents, upstairs to see one of his Christmas presents, a new wireless system. Blaise was eagerly telling him about the PlayStation he'd gotten from his uncle, and Draco gathered that it was similar to the Game Boy that Blaise had sold to Draco years before, but bigger and better somehow. Draco hoped he'd be able to try it one day. Once upstairs, Draco locked and warded his door, casting a muffling charm. Theo and Blaise exchanged a look, knowing they were finally going to hear the real reason they were up here. Hermione asked me to find out from my father or his friends some info about something the Dark Lord is seeking at the Department of Mysteries. Has anyone come to speak with Tiberius or someone about it at your homes? Not that I've seen, but I've been avoiding spending much time with old Ty these days, Theo drawled with a smirk. It's usually bad for my health. Blaise and Draco chuckled darkly. It was difficult to get hit by an irrationally and perpetually angry wizard when you weren't in the same room with them. Blaise confirmed that Selwyn hasn't said anything. Well, if there's any way to push the discussion to it, try. I don't know what it is, and I don't know if their side knows either, but he's searching for it, so it can't be good if he gets it. What does the Department of Mysteries have that this guy wants? Don't they mainly study unknowns, intangibles? Blaise mused thoughtfully. I'm honestly unsure, Draco answered. New inventions, weapons, experimental potions. It could be anything, but if we can find out for her, we've got to give it a try. Do. Or do not. There is no try, Blaise said in an odd voice. Draco gave him a confused look. You can't be breaking into the fire whiskey before the parents clear out, mate, or you'll get us chucked out. He shook his head at the wizard. Oh. Tonight was not the night to get a coherent thought from Lucius. There was much discussion about how much better things have been years before when the Dark Lord held more power, how the future was in their grasp. There were names of people mentioned that Draco hadn't heard before. Weasley's father was mentioned in passing, but only that he'd gotten what he deserved, sticking his nose in where it didn't belong. Draco tried to follow up to ask what had happened, but Nott and McNair began yelling over each other, arguing about an old Quidditch match, drawing in the other men, and the chance was lost. Eventually, the ladies left for the solarium, the men for Lucius's study, and the handful of teens were left to finish off the nearly empty bottles of champagne and gluing. Pansy snuck away with Warrington to the gardens. Draco hoped he knew what he was getting into. Flint led Tracy to a sitting room nearby, and Millie and Greg simply snogged on the chaise in the far corner of the room, not seeming to care who saw them. Vince, Adrian, and Thad left for the kitchens to find another tart flamby, leaving Draco alone with Theo and Blaise by the fireplace. Did you hear anything? Draco asked quietly so as not to disturb the kissing couple in the corner. Not that they could have heard anything but each other over all their groaning and slurping. Theo just shook his head, but Blaise tilted his head from side to side to indicate that he wasn't sure. I didn't hear anything, but Avery seemed to be thinking very hard about something when your father mentioned the future. It was as though he was trying to figure something out himself. The future, as inches. Divination, do they have seers in the Duem? Draco mused. Probably. You should ask Trelawney when we get back, mate. Ask her to gaze into your crystal balls, if you know what I'm getting at. Theo snorted in laughter at his own joke, the gluing having a rapid effect. Draco shot a well-aimed stream of water at Theo's chest. Shut your mouth, you sick wanker, he retorted, then joined Theo and Blaise in laughter. Although she's got about as much chance of telling the future from my balls as she does from hers. The three boys roared with laughter, a moment of hilarity passing between them that, sadly, seemed only too rare nowadays. Chapter 28. The Not At All Great Escape. The New Year's guests had all departed on January 1st by mid-afternoon, so Draco went back to his room to rest. It had been a full week of galas, parties, teas, feasts, and it had been exhausting. Not to mention fruitless, as there had been no discussion or at least none that he'd overheard of whatever was being kept in the Department of Mysteries. He was on the divan in his sitting area, staring at the handkerchief in his hand, trying to come up with words to say, when a knock at the door startled him. "Draco," his mother called quietly. She entered, casting a muffling charm and locking the door silently. He sat up straighter. His mother seldom had a reason to seek him out in his quarters, preferring to have him summoned by Elf when he was needed. "Mother, is everything all right? I was only wondering if you'd communicated with your friend this holiday." He wasn't sure what to say. He had sent Hermione a gift, of course, and received one in return. She had gifted him a silver Muggle fountain pen and a silver letter opener, with an intricate dragon carved at the top. 2 green emeralds for the eyes. Her note read, "To Draco. You may not need this to read my words or write down your words to me, but this reminded me of you." He had sent her a barrette for her hair. It was a delicate design of pearls and sapphires, their birthstones, arranged in a floral design that almost looked like stars. She had written to thank him early on Christmas morning, and he to her. Other than that, and a brief note from her saying that she'd been enjoying her time with Sirius and the Weasleys and was fine, and his response wishing her a good visit and a happy new year, they had not exchanged notes during the break. "Have you discussed the visit from Creature at all?" "No. I think it may be a good idea to warn them. I don't know what might happen, hopefully nothing, but Bellatrix can be a lot to handle. Alone and wandless she cannot cause much harm, but if she has Creature and he finds a way to help her, it could end badly." Draco sighed and closed his eyes, leaning back on the divan. "I understand." Once his mother was gone, he brought out the handkerchief once more and dictated his note. "The elf from Black House named Creature was here a few days ago. He could not say much, but he told me you were there, or had been there in the past. The secrecy enchantments are still in place because he could not share any details with us about what happens there or where exactly the house is. He only spoke to my mother and myself. I feel sure that my mother is not a threat to the Order. She knows that I have feelings for you and hasn't tried to stop me. She is married to my father, of course, but has never taken the mark." He felt sure that Hermione knew about the dark mark and what it meant. Here he paused, knowing that what was still left unsaid was important. "I accidentally told him that Bellatrix was in Azkaban. I don't think he knew before I told him. I worry he may try to go to her. I don't know what help he can give her, but he may try to help her." He sent off the message. 15 minutes later, a reply from her. "I didn't know Creature could leave. I'll let Sirius know. I wish you hadn't told him her whereabouts, but I'm certain it was not on purpose." Draco slumped on the divan. He had put his witch in potential danger, and had no way to fix it. He and his mother had tried calling Creature back throughout the day that day, to no avail. Even if he somehow had gotten Creature to come back here now, his and his mother's orders would be overruled by anything Bellatrix told him. As the eldest Black family member in their branch of the family tree, Creature clearly had little respect for his actual master, using a flimsy phrase like "get out" as a way to leave the bonds of the house. The chances of him responding to "I'm listening" to Draco were slim. "I'm sorry," he wrote back. She didn't reply, and he fell asleep slumped there on the divan as the sun set. Oh. Their first week back at Hogwarts saw another uptick in the amount of revision and studying needed. Every 5th year, even Weasley, found themselves in the library, reading or writing furiously. Draco tried to find a way to sit near Hermione without attracting attention. But now that Potter didn't have Quidditch practice and had managed to avoid spending every evening in detention, he only had this club that he and Hermione had formed to occupy his time. So Potter spent his evenings studying, meaning that he was always around. And Weasley seldom had an original thought, so he was there, too. She stood and stretched, then had an apparent coughing fit, requiring use of a certain handkerchief to cover her mouth. His pocket heated. Runes. The ancient rune section of the library was quite remote, and as they'd yet to have that class this week, entirely unoccupied. Professor Babbling missed her scheduled international portkey from Japan where she'd spent the holiday, and would not be able to return to school for another 2 days. Draco watched Hermione disappear into the stacks, waited as long as he could to follow, ignoring the smirk from Theo as he stood up, popped a spearmint lozenge in his mouth, then casually stepped into the stacks himself. He found her examining the highest shelf in the section, perched on her tiptoes at the edge of a wobbly library stool that was likely only held together by the flimsiest of magic. One hand held the shelf for balance while the other stretched up to reach the top of a book spine and pull it down. Draco paused to take in the sight before him. Merlin, this witch had no idea what she did to him. He moved closer silently, careful to slide an arm in front of her lest she fall, and tickled the back of her leg. "Ugh, Draco!" she yelled. "You shouldn't scare me like that." She turned to him and he caught her round the waist. From where she stood, she had about 10 inches in height on him. I kind of like being taller than you for once." She placed her hands on his shoulders and squeezed. "I absolutely adore the view, Granger." Draco waggled his eyebrows up at her. She giggled and batted his hands away from her waist, then braced herself on his shoulders and jumped down. "I just wanted to ask if you'd found out anything about the Department of Mysteries." "No, my father was rather tight-lipped about it. He tried to broach the subject with Lucius, claiming to have overheard chatter about the department at the Christmas party. But Lucius had nothing to offer, simply stating that the Dark Lord was seeking something important there that might prove crucial to his taking power." Hermione looked crestfallen. "No one in the Order will reveal anything. We're not even sure why Mr. Weasley was there. Lucius only said that you know who thinks there is something there that can help him gain power. But to be honest, I'm not even sure what they do there. I don't know that anyone really does unless they're an unspeakable. Even the Ministry doesn't have oversight over that department." Hermione was lost in thought. Hopefully whatever it is stays well guarded. Draco trying to steer the conversation before she could ask anything about Bellatrix. "How is your club going?" Hermione brightened. "Very well." She beamed. "We're going to start learning how to cast patronesses soon." Draco was glad to hear it. Professor Umbridge was a horrible teacher. Everything she parroted came straight from the book, which appeared to be written for 8-year-olds. Wow, that's any WTS level material. Who's teaching Potter all this stuff? Professor McGonagall, Dumbledore. He had no idea who was in the Order, but he felt sure that those were safe guesses. "Actually, it's just Harry. He's coming up with the lessons on his own." Hermione smirked a bit. "He'd kind of a natural at it, and he's fought you-know-who before, so it seemed the best fit." Draco's mind reeled. Potter is teaching this stuff on his own. He had seen Potter's Patronus, of course, but casting one and teaching others to cast one were two vastly different skills. Draco knew he had some moderate defensive talents, but Scarface had never seemed particularly adept at anything without Hermione's help. Draco had always been pretty sure that he was the chosen one only because someone somewhere had just flipped a coin and chosen heads over tails or something. "He's doing quite well." As a matter of fact, Hermione frowned at him as though reading his thoughts. "I'm certain," Draco drawled, meeting her gaze mischievously. He reached out to tug her closer, wanting to push away thoughts of any other wizard from her mind. Leaning in, he took in the glorious scent of flowers and cherries. "What's that floral scent?" he murmured near her ear. "My shampoo, maybe. It's got gardenia oil in it." A picture of a delicate and beautiful flower with heady blooms came to Draco's mind. It was one he recalled his mother pointing out when he was younger, saying that he could look and smell, but not touch the flowers would wilt when they came into contact with his skin. He tilted her chin up, smelling the cherry sugar quills that she favored lingering on her tongue. He'd spent more lessons that he should have watching her eat a cherry sugar quill that scent he certainly knew. His lips nearly met hers when she stopped him. "And your mother has heard nothing from Bellatrix?" Here it was. The topic he had hoped to avoid. "No." He sighed heavily. "Azkaban is heavily guarded. The chances that she will escape are very slim. I assume that Sirius only escaped by using his animagus form." Hermione nodded. "From the way Mum speaks of her, the last thing Bellatrix would identify with is an animal. I'm fairly certain to become an animagus. You must be accepting of creatures, to think like them. I doubt that is the case with her." Draco fought to not picture a delicate bird being crushed by a boot. "That's good. Hopefully the Dementors wouldn't allow a house elf in any case. Who knows what Dementors will do or think? Those are some creepy creatures." Draco shivered, remembering the blessedly few encounters from third year that he'd had with the wretched things. "You seem to have no problem pretending to be one." Hermione smirked at him wryly. "Yes, well, Muggle children dress up as ghosts and beasts on Halloween. It doesn't mean they don't find them creepy," Draco reasoned. "How do you know this?" Hermione was always surprised when he brought out a tiny piece of Muggle knowledge. He smirked back at her. I have spoken to other Muggle-borns, you know, Hermione. First year, I remember Finch Fletchley being surprised that we didn't do scary costumes or fancy dress for the feast. She seemed mollified and he leaned into her again. What was your favorite Halloween dress up as a child? I went as a fluffy white bunny one year. I had tall ears and a little white tail. He smiled. As a 6-year-old, I'm sure I'd have found you adorable and delightful. I loved bunnies, he smirked. You're incorrigible, she groused at him, but leaned in and kissed him on the cheek then the neck. He loved the feel of her lips, her tongue on his skin. And you're irresistible, which, he whispered into her hair. Noticing that she had worn her beret again today as she had every day since they'd been back. Revision, essays, defense clubs, all of that could wait for another time. Right now, he just wanted to snog his witch senseless in the stacks of the Hogwarts library. Oh. Only a week later, however, all of their fears became reality. The Daily Prophet arrived as usual that morning at breakfast, and the handful of students who took the paper immediately began exclaiming loudly, bringing other students' attention. Up at the head table, several of the professors were reading intently. Draco found Adrian Pusey perusing a copy in quiet disbelief further down the Slytherin table, and came to read over his shoulder. 10 prisoners had escaped Azkaban. Including in the group was his lunatic aunt and her husband and brother-in-law. Others were mentioned, some names that seemed vaguely familiar to Draco, but his attention was caught entirely by the picture of the deranged witch at the center of the page, directly above the fold. She looked nothing like his mother. Apparently Narcissa had inherited her appearance from a different side of the family. Bellatrix's hair was wild, dirty and matted, but it was the eyes that chilled Draco the most. They looked at once both deranged and on fire, and yet soulless. There was an empty, evil quality about them that made Draco's spine tingle. The corridors that day were buzzing with discussion, so much so that a new educational decree has appeared forbidding professors from speaking to students about anything not pertaining to lessons. Therefore, when Draco asked Professor Vector to be excused to the WC, she had merely said, "My apologies, Mr. Malfoy, but I cannot speak about that." Then with a knowing grin she gestured to the door. He smiled back and took his leave, catching Hermione's eye and winking as he walked out. She looked entirely stressed, much as Draco felt. This was a frightening turn of events, and Draco had no idea what it meant for himself or his mother. Oh. That night, he called home. Narcissa answered immediately, and she looked even more nervous and stressed as Hermione had. "You have heard then?" she asked with no preamble. "Yes. Have you spoken with?" "No." His mother bit her lip, looking over her shoulder as though checking to see if anyone had heard her. Then she continued, "Your father has been gone for a couple of hours. I don't know what is happening, but it is not good. I think it best if you plan to stay at school for the Easter holidays." Draco had almost never stayed behind for Easter. Typically by then, he was tired of the bitter Scottish winter and was ready for the milder spring of Wiltshire. Not to mention, the idea of voluntarily subjecting himself to more time with Umbridge seemed mental. But this year, under the circumstances, he had to agree with his mother. "I understand. Will you tell me if anything changes?" "Of course, my dragon." His mother did not often use her pet name for him anymore, but Draco found it comforting. "No matter what happens, I love you." Draco's fear ratcheted up immediately. He had not thought through the potential danger to his mother. Lucius and Narcissa had been seen as potential traitors to the Dark Lord's cause when they had not sought him out after his supposed death years before. Bellatrix apparently had maintained her loyalty to Voldemort and might seek out her sister for retribution. Draco had only been worried about Bellatrix in a general sense before. Now he realized that the danger may be even closer and more personal than he thought. "Mum, you don't think she would hurt you?" "I don't believe so, darling. Bellatrix is many things, but spilling the blood of a pureblood, and a sister at that, I don't think she would go that far." "What about your other sister, Andromeda?" Narcissa's face grew even more worried. "That I am not certain about. Andromeda is Bellatrix's sister and a pureblood, but Bellatrix would see her as a blood traitor. Her crime of loving a Muggle-born would be seen as even worse than what we supposedly did. Perhaps I will reach out to her." Draco's stomach clenched. "Be careful, Mum." Draco knew it was futile to tell her this, knew that she would be careful, but still felt it his duty to say it. "Of course, my dragon. I must go." and in a flash of green flames, Narcissa was gone. So Andromeda's crime, the thing that got her disowned and banished from the family, had been to love a Muggle-born. Draco's breath came more shallowly and rapidly. Bellatrix would consider this a punishable offense. Possibly punishable by death. Draco didn't know much about Bellatrix, but based on the stories his mother had shared and the wild look in her eyes in the Daily Prophet, Draco had a feeling that any death dealt out by his dear Aunt Bella would not be quick, simple, or painless. That night he dreamed of red birds, of hollow bones and brittle cherry sugar quills snapping under heavy boots. And, oh,